Firstly, I just wanted to say that I had initially planned to combine the intelligence communities of Canada and the United States into one single episode, but due to the sheer complexity and importance of this topic, the two countries will be covered in two separate episodes. The episode covering the United States intelligence community will come out next month. Thank you for your support. Since the October 2017 Quebec City Mosque shooting by supposed far-right terrorist Alexandre Bissonnette, certain experts and media figures alike have raised questions about the Canadian intelligence community's focus. Jessica Davis and Wesley Clark of the Globe and Mail, Liam B. Twomey of Intelligence Fusion, James Ellis of the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security and Society, and Jim Bronskill of the Canadian Press all agree that far-right terrorism is a national security threat to Canada. They also agree that fighting it should be made a priority, and that arguments that say otherwise are clearly, quote, oversimplistic and dangerous. These all argue that far-right terrorism should be further prioritized, at the expense of resources to monitor and counter other kinds of terrorism, primarily Islamic extremist terrorism. Such a position could legitimately be argued, as the number of deaths from far-right terrorism in Canada is higher than that of Islamic extremist terrorism, being 6 versus 2, and being that the number of members of the far-right fringe groups far surpass that of other kinds of terrorist groups in Canada. I, however, will use this episode to argue the contrary position. To do so, I am joined by former CSE and CSIS intelligence analyst and linguist, Phil Gurski, who served in Canadian security intelligence for 32 years and now acts as founder and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting. Our thesis will be that in terms of counterterrorism efforts, the Canadian intelligence community, including CSIS, the RCMP, the CAF, and others, should continue to focus on Islamic extremist terrorism, while also trying to find additional funding to explore other threats, including far-right terrorism. In doing so, this episode will be split into two segments. First, we will look at the context behind this episode, defining terrorism, identifying the different kinds of terrorism and groups we will look at, and looking at the focus, priorities, and strategies of Canadian intelligence since the 1990s. Then, Phil Gurski will make his case for our thesis, accompanied by my thoughts on what other priorities should also be considered, namely counterintelligence and counterproliferation. This episode may act as a policy brief for the Government of Canada regarding federal intelligence priorities and strategies. We have to define two fundamental terms to level the playing field. First, what is intelligence? The CIA provides us with a thorough definition, saying that it refers to, quote, the collecting and processing of that information about foreign countries and their agents, which is needed by our government for its foreign policy and for national security. While other agencies and experts, through the passing of time, may offer different definitions, the fundamental idea behind intelligence remains as presented within the CIA's definition. What is terrorism then? Well, it is understood to be indiscriminate violence against civilians or non-combatants in the pursuit of a political, ideological, religious, or social goal. In the case of Islamic State, for example, it would be violence against civilians for religious and political reasons, as their stated goal is to establish an Islamic caliphate and to eradicate demographic groups such as Shia Muslims, Christians, and Yazidis. It is usually committed by a non-state group or actor, although states can fund, organize, and carry out terrorism and threaten world peace. States that do so may generally be referred to as rogue or outlaw states. In terms of the intelligence community, we are looking at both civilian and military intelligence agencies in Canada, including CSIS, CSE, the Department of National Defence, Public Safety Canada, the Canadian Armed Forces, the RCMP, CBSA, and the Privy Council Office. These agencies have undergone many changes since their inception. However, their focus since the First Gulf War has been well defined. Based on different media, academic, and government reports, including Dr. Sokolsky's Realism Canadian Style, National Security Policy and a Correction Legacy, we can see that the intelligence community since the 1990s has focused mostly on backing US, UN, and NATO-led foreign policy. This principle was followed through Canada's involvement in the First Gulf War, in the Yugoslav Wars, and in Somalia, all of which contributed to Canada's growing reputation as a global peacekeeping and peacemaking power, and as an intelligence ally of the United States. On the domestic front, however, in the 1990s, the intelligence community had to deal with containing and identifying the threat posed by the Ochre crisis, as well as coordinating the response to national disasters known as the 1997 Red River Flood and the 1998 North American ice storm. It is worth noting, though, that these events are much smaller in scope, and were primarily or uniquely run by the Canadian Armed Forces, rather than civilian intelligence agencies. This balance was more or less continued from the 2000s until the Justin Trudeau administration. Despite Canada not officially joining the US war effort in Iraq, Canada has been involved with helping such an effort in many respects. These include providing Canadian exchange officers to the United States military in its invasion and occupation, providing training to the Iraqi military and police, and dedicating over $300 million to post-war reconstruction. Canada has also officially partaken in the US-led efforts in Afghanistan, Libya, Mali, and in the global fight against Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, and other Islamic extremist terrorist groups. Canada is also currently pursuing more than 16 disclosed operations around the world that require a minor or significant intelligence presence, most of which are related to counterterrorism, counterintelligence, counterinsurgency, peacekeeping, counter-narcotics, and counter-proliferation, oftentimes in direct partnership with the United States, NATO, and the United Nations. These include Operation Caribe in the Caribbean Sea, Operation Snow Goose in support of the UN peacekeeping force in Cyprus, Op Unifier in support of the Ukraine security forces, Op Impact in Iraq and Syria, and Op Proteus in Jerusalem. Recently, most of the intelligence workload has focused on coordinating priorities with the Americans and other Five Eyes partners, in agreement with the priorities laid out by legislative acts of every intelligence agency in the country, most notably the CSIS Act. This has pushed intelligence priorities to also include, on top of the priorities laid out above, providing cover and protection to Canadian diplomats, agents, and foreign agents under its protection abroad, as was the case in the Iran hostage crisis. It is also working with the United States government on border issues, including drug smuggling, organized crime, and terrorism, along with the CBSA and Coast Guard, and monitoring, tracking, and action against terrorist-prone online and offline chatter. Our objective in this episode is to help the Canadian intelligence community in facing these threats and pursuing these aforementioned priorities to their fullest extent. In the next segment, we will argue for a continuation of these priorities, starting with commentary from Phil Gurski, who will make his case as to why we should not shift counterterrorism funding and resources away from monitoring and facing Islamic extremist terrorism. It is my pleasure to introduce him today, and I thank him for his time and service to Canada and the intelligence practice.
Hello, my name is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Ottawa, Canada, and concurrently the Director of the Security, Economics, and Technology program within the Professional Development Institute at the University of Ottawa. More importantly, in terms of context for my comments today, I am a retired intelligence analyst with the Canadian government. I spent more than 32 years in security intelligence and foreign intelligence, 17 and a half years with CSE, Communications Security Establishment, which is Canada's Signals Intelligence Organization. I worked there from 1983 to 2001 as a multilingual analyst, focusing a lot on the Middle East and Africa. I was both an Arabic and a Farsi linguist. From 2001 to 2015, I worked for CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, as a senior strategic analyst looking at Islamist extremism, primarily homegrown jihadis. I want to weigh in today on this debate that is gaining some ground in Canada and probably more largely throughout the Western world on what our security intelligence and law enforcement agencies should be focusing on when it comes to terrorism. We, of course, live in a post 9/11 world that has defined our counterterrorism response greatly. Not surprisingly, in the wake of an attack in which almost 3,000 people were killed, it stands to reason that security intelligence and law enforcement, and as well as military forces, have been focused almost exclusively on looking at Islamist extremism, or jihadis, use the term that you prefer. jihadis carried out the 9/11 attacks. The vast majority of terrorist groups around the world are Islamist extremist. Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, Boko Haram, Jamaat Islamiyah, Al-Shabaab, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Abu Sayyaf group. The list goes on and on and on and on. And therefore, it's not just the attacks of 9/11 that warranted this response, but the fact that on any given day around the world, a terrorist attack is carried out by a group that we could safely and accurately call Islamist extremist in nature. I would argue then that the way that we've looked at terrorism over the past 20 years has been spot on. We've been focusing our resources exactly where we should have been for the past 20 years. Now, that's not to say that past practices should dictate future actions, but I'm going to get there. But I think that they still do, and I'll try to argue why. If you look at the most recent reporting for the Institute for Economics and Peace, an Australian think tank that puts out the Global Terrorism Index, latest report 2019, the vast majority of attacks and the vast majority of victims around the world are attacks in which Islamist extremists are responsible. And the top 5 countries, i.e. Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, Somalia, and I forget, maybe it's Syria, all those attacks were carried out by jihadis. Every single one. Now, the argument goes is that from a Western perspective, and by Western I'm referring to us here in Canada, of course, United States, Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, that the time has come for a shift in how we do counterterrorism. A lot of people have argued that Islamist extremism no longer poses a threat, at least not to the extent it was in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and that the current threat is actually what we call far-right extremism. That's a very nebulous term. It's kind of a catch-all. From my perspective, it encapsulates neo-Nazis, white supremacists, white nationalists, groups like the Boogaloo Boys in the United States who want to foment a new revolution, groups of that kind of ilk. And there are those who've said that that's where the number one threat comes from, and that's where we should deploy our resources. Now, it's true, if you look at statistics from the United States in particular over the past 20 or 25 years, there have been far more deaths from what we would call far-right extremists than there have from jihadis. It's about a 5 or 6 to 1 ratio, if memory serves me correct. If you look at Canada, you could argue that given we've only had very few successful terrorist attacks here in Canada, that the attack on a mosque in Quebec City in January of 2017, carried out by a supposed right-wing extremist, Alexandre Bissonnette, in which 6 people were killed, far outweighs the fact that the Islamist extremist attacks in Canada have only killed 2. And those 2 died within a 2-day period in 2014. Martin Couture-Rouleau killed Warrant Officer Patrice Vincent outside of Montreal before he was killed by the RCMP. And Michael Zahaf-Bibeau killed Corporal Nathan Cirillo at the War Memorial in Ottawa before he too was killed in an attack on Parliament Hill. He was gunned down. So that's 6 deaths versus 2. That's a 3 to 1 ratio. For the record, on this podcast, I'm not going to include the attacks by incels in Canada, Alec Manassian, and another attack in Toronto in February of 2020. I don't consider those to be acts of terrorism. I consider those to be acts of violent, hateful misogyny. Many people have to disagree with me vehemently on this point, but for my comments here today, I'm going to extract those deaths. I don't think they're terrorist deaths. Again, we can agree to disagree on that. If one therefore goes solely by the numbers, it seems, at least in Canada and the United States, although I would argue less so in Europe, that CSIS and the RCMP and the FBI are missing the point. They have taken their eye off the ball, and they're still focused largely on Islamist extremism. For the record, when I worked for CSIS, it is true, the vast majority of counterterrorism resources that we had deployed in investigations, collecting intelligence, were aimed at jihadis, 99.9%. I left CSIS in 2015. It is my understanding that investigations into far-right extremism have gained. I don't have any statistics to give you because I no longer work for the service, but it certainly is more than when I was there. When I was there, it was next to zero. Very, very few. Obviously, it's higher than that now. What then to make of this claim that those of us who worked in security intelligence just didn't get it? Well, I'm going to push back very strongly against that in this podcast. And I'll try to use data. I'll try to use reason and analysis to convince you why I think we're doing exactly what we should be doing. As already noted, from a worldwide perspective, there is no question in 2020 that the vast majority of attacks that are terrorist in nature are carried out by jihadis. Name any country in the world, look at the terrorist incidents, they're all carried out by jihadis, or the vast majority. So on that front alone, you could say we can't afford to ignore the jihadi threat. Canadians are still have traveled historically to join groups like Al-Shabaab and ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. They have committed acts of terrorism in the name of those terrorist groups in Algeria, in Somalia, in Bangladesh, in Iraq. I'd be very surprised if people were not still trying to leave the country to join terrorist groups just this week alone. I'm recording this on the 30th of August, 2020. A woman in the Toronto area was arrested and charged with seeking to join ISIS in 2019. That was just a year ago. Her husband has been charged with the same offense. These groups are still attracting people, and therefore it is incumbent on CSIS and the RCMP and Canada Border Services Agency, or CBSA, to identify and prevent these people from traveling in the first place. We have an obligation as a nation to not allow our citizens to go from A to B to become terrorists. That trend is continuing. That trend's not going away. But if we talk about domestically, is there a case to be made that we need to shift resources from Islamist extremism to the far right? Again, I would answer no. It is not time to do that. I agree we have to devote some resources to the far right, but to say that we have to deal with it to the exclusion of the jihadis, or in other words, to shift resources from one particular task to another, I think is unwarranted. Let me explain. When you look at counterterrorism as a function of a government, in Canada, that's CSIS and the RCMP for the most part, it's really important that you take into account not just the attacks that took place. Again, we've only had a small number of successful attacks in Canada in post 9/11 period. So we had the two in 2014. We had an attack on a Canadian Forces recruiting center in Toronto in 2017, a few people injured. We had an attack on a Canadian Tire. We had in Scarborough, a few employees injured. We had an attack outside of Commonwealth Stadium in Edmonton, Alberta, outside a football game, 5 people injured. Those are all carried out by jihadis, by the way. Then we had the attack in Quebec City, in which 6 people were killed and several others wounded. You have to take into account all the foiled attacks, i.e. the ones we prevented from happening. And in that case, there have been many attacks that did not take place because of the efforts of CSIS and the RCMP. To give you just one small example, there's the infamous Toronto 18 from 2005-2006, a case I worked on very closely from front to end, from beginning to when they were arrested on June 2nd, 2006. That group of jihadis had planned to detonate 3 one-ton fertilizer bombs in various parts of Toronto and in the Toronto area. And had they been successful, they would have killed and wounded thousands of people. Thousands of people. But they didn't, because we had penetrated them with human sources and surveillance and court-authorized intercept warrants, and as a result, nobody died, no one got hurt. Same can be said for the Via Passenger Plot 2013 and the 2010 Operation Samosa plot in Ottawa, as well as the BC Legislature plot in 2013 as well. These were important terrorist plots, which led to convictions in some cases. The Victoria one led to a conviction which was overthrown in an absolutely horrendous decision by an appeals judge, in my opinion. Obviously, I'm biased, worked on the case. We have to acknowledge that had we sat back and done nothing, hundreds, if not thousands, of people would have been killed or injured by Islamist extremist attacks here in Canada. That has to be part of our calculation. Here's one thing more. If it is true, as it is, that we were devoting the vast majority of our resources to Islamist extremism in the post 9/11 period until the present day, it stands to reason we weren't looking at the far right. You only have so many resources. You deploy them where you see the threat is greatest, and therefore some things fall off the plate. They don't get looked at. People don't get followed. People don't get investigated. In all the years where we focused on jihadis, and not on the far right, with the exception of the attack in Quebec City in January 2017, can anyone point to a single successful far-right attack in Canada? The answer is no. Again, I am excluding the incel phenomenon. One would think that dedicated terrorists of the right-wing ilk would have had free rein to plan, to acquire weapons, to acquire bombs, to locate targets, to do their reconnaissance on where an attack would be most lethal. And because they weren't being watched, they would have been successful. And yet not a single attack, with the exception of the 2017 mosque attack in Quebec City, has taken place. What does that suggest? Well, it certainly suggests to me that there were no plots. If there had been plots, they would have succeeded because we weren't looking at them. Very different from the jihadi plots, which we were looking for, and which we were investigating, and which we did disrupt, and which we did take to court. This is a very uncomfortable fact for those who maintain that we should be looking at the far right. Again, yes, we should, but not to the detriment of looking at the jihadis. The jihadi threat has not gone away. In fact, worldwide, it's greater than it ever was in terms of numbers of countries and numbers of groups. I don't want to go into a long analysis of Islamic State, but suffice to say that, in a Mark Twain kind of way, rumors of its death were greatly exaggerated. Islamic State is on the ascendant in Iraq and Syria. It's not on the descendant. The Pentagon realizes this. Despite the so-called defeat of Islamic State in 2019, despite the so-called dissolution of the caliphate, Islamic State is maybe not as lethal as it was in 2014, 2015, but it's not far behind. And the same goes for Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria and neighboring states, as well as the bevy of Islamic State affiliates. There's an Islamic State affiliate in Mozambique that's been successful of late. There's one in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's ones in the Sahel. There's ones in Yemen. There's ones in Afghanistan. And the list goes on and on and on and on. My simple point here is that when you work for security intelligence, you have to make decisions almost on a daily basis as to where you're going to deploy your resources. There are always more threats than there are resources. You can't do everything simultaneously. It simply doesn't work that way. And to my analysis, we have deployed our resources exactly where we should have been deploying them over the past 20 years. And we will need to continue to deploy them against the number one threat, which is Islamist extremism going forward, while at the same time finding the resources to look at the far right, look at the 3%ers, look at La Meute, look at the Proud Boys, look at the other groups that are out there. Soldiers of Odin, these other wannabe right-wing guys. The other issue you have to bear in mind is that there is not a one-to-one relationship between people who espouse extremist views and those who carry out violent extremist action. Going back to my days at CSIS, the vast majority of people who were completely in tune with Islamist extremism, they drunk the Kool-Aid, believed fervently in what the ideology told them, never did a damn thing, never acted out, never planned an attack, never carried out an attack. Now, I don't have statistics that I can sort of share with you, given the nature of what I saw, what I had access to when I worked for CSIS. But suffice to say that very few people either have the capability or the intent or the desire to actually go from talk to action. In other words, many people talk the talk, very few walk the walk. I would argue in 2020 that yes, there are definitely jihadis still out there. There are definitely right-wing extremists out there. I would argue there are people left of center who certainly talk in terms that indicates the potential for violence. And yet, if past patterns continue, the vast majority of those will never do anything. One could argue they need to be investigated to ensure they're not part of the very small percentage that actually act on their thoughts, and I would concur with that. But it becomes a resource issue. Where's the biggest bang for your buck? No pun intended. One thing we cannot do as security, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies is to rob Peter to pay Paul. If you take resources away from Islamist extremist investigations to put them on the far right or far left or whatever, what happens when the tasks from which they were taken end up causing an act of terrorism? So you take people away from Islamist extremism, you put them on the far right. Next thing you know, you don't have enough resources, intelligence officers, surveillance, people to listen to intercepts, et cetera, and one falls through the cracks. You get an attack, like Sahaf Bibo, like Kutuhuro, like the guy in Edmonton. The public is very unforgiving in this regard. One of the adages that you hold to when you work for security intelligence is it's very simple, and it's you're only as good as your last failure. Nobody cares when you succeed. Nobody. They only care when you fail, and that's when the finger pointing starts, and that's when the blame is assigned, and that's when the questions are raised. What are you doing? What are you not doing? What is wrong with you? How come you didn't stop this? Why didn't you have people monitoring this? Why didn't you have your resources deployed in the proper direction? That is the reality of working for security intelligence. And if we were to have a number of successful right-wing plots that we failed to detect because of our resource allocation, which we have not in the post 9/11 period, that would be a strong argument for looking at it more greatly. That's the challenge we face in 2020. There are a multiplicity of actors from a multiplicity of ideologies, which our security intelligence and law enforcement agencies, in theory, should be watching to prevent attacks from happening. We're in the prevent business. We're not in the mopping up, sweeping up glass and collecting body parts business. We are paid to stop. We're not paid to sit by and let things happen through negligence or lack of resources, whatever. And yet, we're not seeing far-right plots on the scale in 2020 that warrants that shift in resources. I'm happy to be proven wrong. Provide me with your own data to show that I'm barking up the wrong tree. I don't think that I am. And moving forward, I don't have a crystal ball in front of me, but I do think that it is highly likely that this resource allocation is going to have to remain in that direction. The vast majority of men and women will have to look at Islamist extremist threat for the foreseeable future. Now, if it's true that we have more people in Canada who espouse the far right and they're moving from thought to action, yeah, we'll have to put resources there too. Where those resources are coming from, I have no idea. In the post 9/11 period, in the immediate aftermath of those attacks, CSIS and the RCMP and CSE and other organizations did very well in terms of resource allocation. We got more money, we got more people to do our jobs because we had just witnessed the single greatest attack of terrorism in history. And the ethos at the time was it's not going to happen again. Just as an aside, those of us in the security intelligence world, when 9/11 happened, our immediate kind of reaction was we were waiting for the other shoe to drop. We didn't think 9/11 was it. We thought there were other attacks being planned. As it turns out, there really weren't. But you only know what you know at the time. Those days are over, especially in the we're still in COVID. When we get past COVID, we have governments that are trillions of dollars in debt. You think CSIS is going to get more resources, or the RCMP, or CSE? Combine that with the whole defund the police movement, which is an incredibly ignorant way of seeing the problem. So no, these organizations are not going to get more money and more people. Therefore, they have to do with what they have. They have to allocate their current resources to try to cover the multiplicity of threats I've already referred to the best of their ability. All the while not getting it wrong. All the while not engaging in a failure, because that's when the criticism rises. I think that security intelligence services, generally speaking, don't get a lot of sympathy. I think people see us as right-wing in our outlook. I would push back against that big time as well. So we're not going to get a lot of support for, oh, woe is us, we need more money, we need more resources. And yet, you can only do so much with the money and people that you have. I saw an incredible burnout after 9/11. People weren't going home. We had to turn over every rock to see where the next plot was coming from. And more importantly, from a Canadian perspective, we had to demonstrate that there was no Canadian link to 9/11, because if there had been, that would have had catastrophic effects on our relationship with the Americans. Burnout's a real thing. People have lives, they have families. They can't work 24/7 indefinitely. It leads to people leaving. It leads to people becoming less effective. So that's the nature of terrorism in 2020. I have no reason to suspect there has been a significant change in where our resources should be deployed. I acknowledge fully that we need to devote some resources to the far right. I would also argue we might want to start looking at the far left, eco-terrorism being a distinct possibility. And at the same time, don't forget that we have other things we need to worry about from a security intelligence perspective. There's still foreign espionage, which is covered under 2A of the CSIS Act. We still have countries that aren't our friends and are seeking to spy on us, like Russia, like China, like Iran, like North Korea. Then we have foreign interference. That's Section 2B of the CSIS Act. Think of the Russian interference in the American elections in 2016 and probable interference in the elections in a month and a half from now. We have to look at that as well. And where do the resources come from for that? You have to have counter-espionage resources. You have to have counter foreign interference resources. And you have to have counter-terrorism resources. You have to do all the above with what you have. That's the challenge facing security intelligence in 2020. This is not a woe is me story. I'm a former. I don't work there anymore. I still have an interest in it, obviously. I spent more than 3 decades doing it, and I feel from our former colleagues. But this is the nature of the threat. One more thing, when it comes to so-called religious terrorism, remember that in the Canadian Criminal Code, in Section 83.01, an act of terrorism is defined as a serious act of violence carried out for political, ideological, or religious reasons. Now we have, in terms of the third one, religion, we have tended to think of that as jihadis, Islamist extremists, those who take their inspiration from an aberrant interpretation of Islam. Well, I've got news for you. There are other forms of terrorism that are carried out in support of or in furtherance of other forms of religion, i.e. not just Islam. And I wrote a whole book on it in 2019 called When Religions Kill, available from Lynn Reiner. There's Hindu extremism. Just read the news in India about Hindu extremists killing Muslims. There's Buddhist extremism, which should be an oxymoron since Buddhists are supposed to be peaceful people, in countries like Sri Lanka and Thailand, and most importantly in Myanmar, in the Myanmar government's campaign against the Rohingya in northwestern part of the country. So Buddhists against Muslims. There's Jewish extremism in the West Bank. There is Christian extremism. In fact, there are a lot of commonalities between some parts of the far right, especially in the United States, and the Christian far right. There's this notion of Christianity as the natural religion in the United States. And finally, there's still Sikh extremism. There was an article in the National Post the other day about the fact that Sikh extremism is still a concern here in Canada. Don't forget, the single largest act of terrorism in world history prior to 9/11 was the Air India attack in June of 1985. And that was carried out by Canadian Sikh extremists. Sikh terrorism is still a reality in 2020. Maybe not as high a priority as it was back then. And I'm just as a sideline, I am working on my next book looking at a history of terrorism in Canada from Confederation, i.e. 1867 to the present, where I look at all the acts of terrorism through the lens of the security service as we saw it as Canada's main protectors. So in conclusion, I get concerned when I hear people talk about, well, you guys are just, you don't understand. Your focus is on the wrong threat. You're behind the times. It's not about jihadis anymore. It's about white supremacists. It's about neo-Nazis. It's about fascists. No, it's not. It's about all the above simultaneously. That's what you have security intelligence and law enforcement agencies for. That's what we ask them to do on our behalf. The threats are on multiple levels, from multiple actors, espousing multiple ideologies. And it all has to be done at the same time. So before you criticize thesis and the RCMP and the government for getting it wrong from your perspective, do a little digging. Look at some data. Actually start with facts as opposed to coming up with a position that is based on your own interpretation of the world. It's always good to start with facts. And the facts dictate quite clearly in my mind that the Islamist extremist threat is still by far the number one, not just worldwide, but here in Canada, but that other threats have to be looked at, not to mention the counter-espionage and counter-foreign interference I referred to a few minutes ago. That's the reality of security intelligence services in Canada as of 2020. Anyway, that's my view. You may disagree with me. If so, please contact me. I'd love to have a conversation with you about these matters. I still have a passion for this, despite the fact I'm supposed to be retired. I'm certainly open to other views, as long as your views are fact-based. Thanks for listening.
As alluded to by Phil at the end of his commentary, there are other threats Canada has to face, which are not terrorism. These mostly relate to counterintelligence and counterproliferation, which we will explore next. To start, counterintelligence refers to the practice of intelligence in order to prevent or detect foreign spies or any sabotage of one's governmental or societal activities, through election meddling or disinformation campaigns, for example, from a foreign intelligence service. It is meant to protect our country's secrets, information, and institutions from foreign interference. Although this is rarely the case, counterintelligence can sometimes be deadly, as foreign agents may pursue assassination programs in one's country, and thus need to be neutralized rather than arrested or compromised. This kind of activity has also started to be carried out by non-state actors with higher frequency than ever before, especially relating to informational leaks and cybersecurity breaches. Foreign or intelligence service agents' identity and activity may be leaked, and government databases may be compromised, putting our intelligence agencies and their agents at risk of exposure. There are thus two main types of activity that counterintelligence attempts to prevent: human and cyber activity. Although human counterintelligence is still most prevalent through the form of counterespionage, cyber counterintelligence is a growing threat that needs to be considered carefully by our intelligence services. It is thus established that one's intelligence services, information, secrets, and institutions can be infiltrated and penetrated through human and cyber means, as well as other less significant means. These include signals counterintelligence and imagery counterintelligence, for example, which still need to be paid attention to. Canada's counterintelligence threats are highly similar to those of the United States and Five Eyes partners, as these countries often share intelligence missions, strategies, priorities, and techniques. In his last book, To Catch a Spy, The Art of Counterintelligence, former CIA Chief of Counterintelligence James Olson explains that the biggest counterintelligence threats are China, Russia, and Cuba. This is because they are, quote, recruiting spies in our midst and stealing our secrets and cutting-edge technologies, end quote. They constitute massive threats in terms of, quote, espionage, cyber, and covert action assault, end quote. Olson states that although all three countries' intelligence agencies are engaged in many dangerous counterintelligence activities, China is most infamous for stealing secrets and infiltrating government agencies, Russia for disinformation and espionage through double and triple agents, and Cuba for its aggressive and fearless approach in recruiting spies and outing and disciplining foreign agents. According to a recent report from the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians in Ottawa, made up of members from each party represented in Canadian Parliament, Canada has been the target of significant and sustained efforts by hostile states to interfere in Canadian domestic affairs. The two countries named in the report as the main aggressors are the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation. According to Olson, Cuba also often relays stolen information and assets to Beijing and Moscow. As he also alluded to in his book, Although he does not add this country to the list, the Mossad, Shin Bet, and the Israeli intelligence services in general constitute a counterintelligence challenge, although not necessarily a major threat to the likes of Cuba, China, or Russia. Olson gives the example of Jonathan Pollard, who was a U.S. intelligence analyst found guilty of providing top-secret classified secrets to Israel, to prove his point. Pollard was then sentenced to life in prison. There are other examples of Israeli double agents infiltrating Five Eyes intelligence agencies, although Pollard is the most prominent. Moreover, according to Israeli intelligence expert and journalist for Haaretz, Yossi Melman, Israel is also a counterintelligence threat as it is stealing Five Eyes secrets. In fact, he states that, quote, Russia and China have in recent years enhanced their espionage efforts in Israel, particularly to obtain access to both state-owned and private sector Israeli tech companies, and through them to the United States, a close ally of Israel, end quote. Secrets about American companies, particularly American defense companies, are also being relayed to China through intellectual property stolen from Israel. It thus stands to reason that the same is being done against Canada. Non-state actors are also highly dangerous in this regard, as financial and personal reward often lead intelligence employees to betray their country. To state simply one recent example, last year, an RCMP intelligence officer named Cameron Ortiz was arrested for allegedly selling Canadian and Five Eyes secrets to criminals, including an international drug trafficker and foreign enemy governments. This tactic of luring agents for financial or personal rewards is also used by state actors. Non-state actors have also targeted Canadian public institutions, orchestrating information leaks, trying to hack into public systems, or sowing disinformation and discord in the Canadian public and government. Although Russian influence was at its peak in the former USSR era, China seems to have replaced Russia in this role, corrupting Canadian academia and media through big money financing. Stories in recent years have surfaced which detail how the Chinese Communist Party has planted Chinese spies in university student associations, monitored Chinese and Canadian students' behavior on university campuses, and funded academic research favorable to the Chinese Communist Party. It has also inserted itself in media discourse, funding YouTubers and journalists to do their bidding in Canadian public discourse. Recent telecommunications and social concerns over Chinese companies like Huawei, TikTok, and WeChat are also worth mentioning, although these are much more pervasive in the American system, which we will explore in our next episode. These are threats that need to be taken seriously and need to be remedied quickly in order for Canada to maintain its place as a reliable and foolproof ally of the Five Eyes community and other intelligence partners. As suggested by Olson and others, this may be remedied by first putting more rigor into the civilian and military intelligence hiring process, doubling down on financial and personal red flags and character flaws. An internal inquiry into the intelligence community's hiring process will thus be in order, followed by possibly more funding to CI units across the federal service to counter and prevent growing and persistent CI threats. Now, in terms of cyber CI threats, CSE in particular, as well as the RCMP and CSIS, should also continue vigorously hiring cybersecurity and information technology experts and technologists through universities and technical colleges, as well as promoting through social media and media platforms, as has been done in the past 5 years. The Canadian IC's information is at risk, and only the country's best and brightest may help safeguard it and protect Canada against the growing threats outlined prior. Finally, a more active and offensive rather than passive CI strategy must be put in place, as we must prevent CI offenses rather than react to them. This will require higher coordination with CI allies within Five Eyes, and for Canada to reconsider partnerships and deals with CI enemies, most notably China and Russia. Counterintelligence must continue to be a priority for Canadian intelligence and should be given more attention and resources whenever possible. Counterproliferation is the last intelligence priority, which we will address in today's episode. Although it is arguably less common of a threat than counterintelligence or counterterrorism, the consequences of a failure to deal with the threat of WMD proliferation have the potential to be much deadlier than either of these two priorities, as a bad counterproliferation strategy may lead to thousands or even millions of deaths. To begin, what exactly is counterproliferation? Well, it refers to the curtailment of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, whether nuclear, biological, chemical, or radiological in nature, in the hands of states and non-state actors and groups. These non-state actors and groups include terrorist groups, as many terrorist groups such as Islamic State have tried to acquire weapons of mass destruction. In fact, in a 2019 interview with the Daily Beast, a chemical weapons expert for ISIS, revealed that Islamic State has been working towards obtaining biological and chemical weapons, including mustard gas and chlorine gas, which it used in an attack against the Kurdish Peshmerga. It is also developing drones capable of dispersing chemical and biological weapons. Al-Qaeda has also been working on nuclear, biological, radiological, and chemical weapons since the 1990s, and they have tried multiple times to use them, including in 1993. It is also worth noting the intended 2006 Toronto terrorist plot, which Phil Gurski mentioned, in which Islamic extremist terrorists intended to use WMDs, in this case 3 one-ton fertilizer bombs, to kill thousands of people in downtown Toronto. Most WMD proliferation, however, occurs at the hands of states. States to watch out for currently include current non-nuclear states North Korea, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Iran, and nuclear states of Israel, India, Pakistan, Russia, China, and the United States. These are mostly states with WMDs which have either used them in the past or threatened to use them, or are actively looking to acquire them for purposes of deterrence or aggression, although the former is most likely. According to the Public Safety Canada's counter-proliferation website, counter-proliferation has become an emerging and ever-growing threat due to the continued globalization process. It states the following: people, goods, and money flow quickly and easily around the globe thanks to modern transportation, trade, financial networks, and the internet. Technology is rapidly advancing in areas such as encryption and cryptocurrency, which can be used to hide illicit activities from authorities. As well, many goods and technologies, including everyday items, have the potential to be used or modified to produce weapons and military items, including WMDs. To fight the threat of proliferation, the Canadian government has engaged in and signed on to many counter-proliferation treaties and partnerships, most of them legally binding. These include signing on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Biological and Toxins Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Hague Code of Conduct Against Ballistic Missile Proliferation, and the Australia Group, tasked with preventing the cross-border export of WMDs and WMD materials. My recommendation is that Canada continue to be an integral and active part of and signatory to these partnerships and treaties, regardless of which government is in power. Another recommendation would be to increase communication between internal partners, being the CBSA, RCMP, and CSIS, ensuring that information sharing is encouraged and maximized. Information sharing, dialogue, and negotiation should also be done more extensively with external partners, mostly foreign governments, in counter-proliferation matters, and to participate in as many multilateral conventions and negotiations on these matters as possible, sending tasked experts and officials from these 3 agencies to report on counter-proliferation matters. Other agencies and departments may be included when relevant, such as Public Safety Canada, Global Affairs Canada, and the Department of National Defense. Frequent meetings with the IAEA to receive updates will also be relevant. Finally, although Canada is currently not a sitting member of the UN Security Council, the Government of Canada should further its efforts to lobby Security Council permanent and non-permanent members to partake in non-proliferation treaties and conventions, including our partners and especially our enemies, as our safety and security and that of the world rely on their conduct. Seeking a non-permanent member seat on the Security Council would also be helpful, although that will have to be done in the next selection cycle. In the meantime, these items laid prior may be a good starting point. In today's episode, I had the pleasure of being joined by former CSE and CSIS intelligence analyst and linguist, Phil Gurski, who served in Canadian security intelligence for 32 years, and now acts as founder and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting. Our thesis was that in terms of counterterrorism efforts, the Canadian intelligence community, including CSIS, the RCMP, the DND, the CAF, and others, should continue to focus on Islamic extremist terrorism, while also trying to find additional funding to explore other threats, including counterintelligence and counterproliferation. In doing so, this episode was split into 2 segments. First, we looked at the context behind this episode, defining terrorism, identifying the different kinds of terrorism and groups we would look at, and looking at the focus, priorities, and strategies of Canadian intelligence since the 1990s. Then, Phil Gurski made his case for our thesis, accompanied by my thoughts on what other priorities should also be considered, namely counterintelligence and counterproliferation. This episode may act as a policy brief for the Government of Canada regarding federal intelligence priorities and strategies. Thank you for joining us in today's rendition of Realpolitik. Please join us in October for a new episode, where in the second part of this series on intelligence priorities, we will explore the United States intelligence community's priorities of the past and present, and what they should be in the future. Feel free to debate the ideas put forward in these episodes by submitting a comment, counter video, or by emailing us at realpolitikpodcast1@gmail.com. Please check out our Patreon if you would like to support us as well. Also, please make sure to go to Phil Gurski's channel, called An Intelligent Look at Terrorism with Phil Gurski, where he produces regular content covering issues relating to terrorism and defense and security issues. The link to his channel will be in the description, as well as link to my channel homepage. All used sources for this episode will be in the description box below.